The alkali dust of redemption settled on everything, a fine ghostly powder that coated the soul as surely as it did the splintered boardwalks. Jack Thorne felt it in his throat, a grit that had nothing to do with the trail and everything to do with the town itself. He pushed through the swinging doors of the saloon, the sudden gloom a welcome respite from the oppressive glare of the high desert sun. The place smelled of stale beer sweat and cheap despair. It was a scent he knew well. He wasn't here for a drink. He was here for answers. His younger brother Sam was sitting in a cell in the town jail, framed for a payroll robbery he couldn't possibly have committed. The lead that had brought Jack to this godforsaken mountain town was thin, but it was all he had. He scanned the room, his gaze lingering on the men hunched over their glasses, their faces etched with the hard lines of a life spent chasing silver that was never truly theirs. Whiskey Jack set his voice a low rasp as he reached the bar. The bartender, a man whose weary eyes had seen it all, slid a glass toward him without a word. Jack didn't touch it. He was looking for a man named Hewitt, a disgruntled freighter who'd supposedly seen the real robbers. Before he could ask, 3 men detached themselves from a corner table. They moved with the lazy confidence of predators who owned their territory. Their silver badges were tarnished, but the authority they represented was absolute, bought and paid for by the man who owned Redemption, Silas Kane. "You're new," the lead deputy said, a stocky man with a drooping mustache and mean little eyes. "Don't get many strangers up here, especially not ones asking questions about Kane's business." Jack kept his posture, relaxed his hands in plain sight on the bar. "My brother's in your jail. I'm just trying to understand the charges." "The charge is robbery," the second deputy chimed in, a lanky youth with a cruel smirk. "And the sentence is a rope. Best you get back on your horse and ride out before you get tangled in it." Jack's gaze remained fixed on the lead deputy. "I'm not leaving without my brother." The deputy chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "That's not your decision to make." He gestured with his chin. "Let's take a walk, friend. The sheriff wants a word." Jack knew how this ended. A walk to a dark alley, a beating, and a warning to leave town. Or worse. He'd seen it a dozen times in his years as a Texas Ranger. He sighed, the sound heavy with a weariness that went bone deep. "I think I'll finish my drink first." The moment stretched taut and silent. Then the lanky deputy reached for him. Jack moved with a speed that belied his tired frame. It was a fluid, economical motion, a block, a twist, and the deputy was slammed face first into the bar. The other 2 went for their guns, but they were saloon bullies, not gunmen. Jack was faster. He drew his Colt, the worn metal an extension of his hand, and brought the barrel down hard on the first man's wrist. A bone cracked with a sickening snap. The third man, more cautious, backed away, his pistol wavering. "Don't be a fool," he snarled. The saloon had erupted. Men scrambled for cover, overturning tables. The bartender ducked his face, a pale mask of terror. Jack ignored them. His focus was on the man in front of him. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he wouldn't run from one. It was a principle that had cost him everything. A shot exploded, not from the deputy's gun, but from the lanky one who had recovered and now fired wildly from the floor. The bullet went wide, not meant for Jack, but for the wall behind him. It ripped through the worn leather of his saddlebag, which he'd slung over a chair, a sharp crack followed by the tinkle of shattering glass. Rage, cold and pure, washed over Jack. He kicked the gun from the young deputy's hand, and in 2 long strides was on the last man standing. He didn't shoot. He disarmed him with brutal efficiency, his face a mask of cold fury. He slammed the man against the wall, the impact rattling the bottles on the shelf. "Tell your boss," Jack's voice was dangerously quiet, "that Jack Thorne is here, and I'm not leaving." He released the man, who scrambled away, dragging his injured companions with him. The saloon was deathly still. Jack walked back to his saddlebag. He reached inside his fingers, trembling slightly, as he pulled out a small, oval-shaped wooden frame. The glass was gone, shattered into 1,000 tiny shards. Beneath it, the delicate, hand-tinted photograph of a smiling woman with kind eyes was now exposed, a small, jagged tear across her cheek. His late wife, Sarah. He carefully brushed the glass fragments away, his breath catching in his throat. The fight, the deputy's cane, it all faded into the background. All that remained was this broken piece of his past, a past he could never outrun. The confrontation had established more than his name. It had reopened a wound that never truly healed. And in the oppressive silence of the saloon, Jack Thorne knew that redemption would demand a price far higher than just his brother's freedom. After the dust settled in the saloon, Jack stepped back out into the harsh light of redemption's Main Street. The town seemed to hold its breath, watching him from behind grimy windows and parted curtains. The 3 deputies had vanished, no doubt, to report back to their master, and an unnatural quiet had fallen. He walked not with a swagger, but with the steady, measured gait of a man who knew he was being judged. The town itself was a testament to Silas Kane's iron grip. The splintered boardwalks groaned underfoot, their planks warped and sun-bleached. Alkali dust coated every surface in a ghostly film, muting the colors of the hand-painted signs on the storefronts. The wind funneled down from the high peaks, howled through the narrow canyons, like a lonesome spirit carrying with it the distant rhythmic clang of hammers from Kane's silver mine, the heartbeat of the town's servitude. This wasn't a place people came to build a future. It was a place they came to be broken. Jack's path took him past the blacksmith's forge. A thick-armed man with a leather apron and a soot-streaked face paused his work, his hammer resting on the anvil. He watched Jack approach, his eyes cautious but not hostile. There was a quiet strength about him, an integrity that seemed out of place in redemption. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement of the saloon brawl that was already the town's biggest news. It was a small gesture, but in a place like this, it spoke volumes. Further down the street, a sign for the General Mercantile hung crookedly over a store with wide, clean windows. A young woman was sweeping the porch, her movements brisk and determined. She had dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, and a face that, while weary, held a spark of defiance. As Jack passed, her eyes met his, and he saw a flicker of shared understanding. She too knew what it was to be squeezed by Kane. This had to be Alara, the woman whose name he'd heard whispered as one of the few who hadn't sold her family's land to the magnate. He saw the tension in her jaw, the way she gripped the broom like a weapon. She was holding on, but barely. He stopped outside the doctor's office, a small clapboard building next to the undertaker's, a grimly practical arrangement. Inside, a man with thinning hair and spectacles perched on his nose looked up from a medical journal. He gave Jack a clinical, detached once-over, his gaze lingering on the bruised knuckles of Jack's right hand. His expression was cynical, as if he'd long ago stopped believing in cures for anything that truly ailed a man. Every person, every building told the same story, a town held captive. Kane didn't just own the mine. He owned the law, the bank, and likely the souls of most of the people. They were all trapped in his web, had their hopes and futures mortgaged against the silver he pulled from the earth. Redemption was a powder keg, its people, a mix of simmering resentment and beaten-down fear waiting for a spark. And as Jack looked up at the barren, unforgiving mountains that ringed the valley, he knew he had just struck it. His fight in the saloon wasn't just a personal matter anymore. It was a challenge to the entire order of this place. He finally reached the jailhouse, a squat stone building that seemed to absorb the light. Sheriff Croft, a man with a fleshy face and a perpetual sneer, sat behind a large desk, his feet propped up. He was polishing a silver star that was far too bright for the rest of his grimy uniform. He was clearly in Kane's pocket, a puppet who enjoyed his role. "Heard you caused some trouble over at the saloon," Thorncroft said, not bothering to lower his feet. "That's a bad way to start your visit." "I'm here to see my brother Jack," said his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Croft smirked. "Visiting hours are over." "You'll make an exception. It wasn't a request." For a moment, the sheriff seemed to consider calling Jack's bluff. He looked at Jack's steady eyes, at the calm way he stood, and something in his posture told him this was not a man who bluffed. With a grumble, he pulled a key from his drawer and tossed it to a deputy cowering in the corner. 5 minutes. And Thorne, don't get any ideas. Jack followed the deputy down a short, dark hallway to the cells. The air was cold and damp, smelling of stone and misery. There were only 2 cells. One was empty. In the other, a figure lay on a cot, turned toward the wall. "Sam," Jack said softly. The figure stirred. Sam Thorne rolled over, and Jack's breath caught in his chest. His younger brother's face was a mess of bruises, his left eye swollen shut, his lip split. He was thinner than Jack remembered. The youthful optimism that had always defined him, extinguished, replaced by a raw, hollowed-out desperation. Jack Sam's voice was a choked whisper. He struggled to sit up, his movements stiff with pain. "You came." "I came." Jack gripped the bars, his knuckles white. "What did they do to you, Sam?" "What they do to everyone who gets in Kane's way." Sam said, his one good eye darting nervously toward the deputy who stood pointedly out of earshot. "Jack, you gotta get me out of here. I didn't do it. I swear I didn't rob that wagon." Jack's past failures weighed on him, a heavy cloak of guilt. He had always been the one to clean up Sam's messes, but this was different. This felt darker. "Tell me what happened." It was a setup. Sam spoke in a frantic, hurried rush. "Kane's been trying to buy up all the land in the valley. The ranchers who won't sell, he finds other ways to persuade them. He offered me a job watching over a shipment. Next thing I know, I'm waking up in a ditch with a head wound and the payroll wagon's empty. Croft and his boys found me with one of the gold sacks. They planted it, Jack. I swear they did." Jack's skepticism, a hard-earned shield from his ranger days, warred with his loyalty. Sam had always been a dreamer, too quick to trust, too slow to see the danger. "Why you, Sam? Why frame you?" Sam leaned closer to the bars, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Because I found something. Something Kane wants to keep buried. It's not about the gold, Jack. It never was." He clutched Jack's sleeve through the bars, his grip surprisingly strong. "Listen to me. You have to listen. Follow the river north to where the old broken pine stands on the ridge. The one that was struck by lightning years ago. Look there. It's not about the gold, Jack. It's about the land." The words were cryptic, born of desperation, but they held the ring of truth. This was the call to action, the first thread in a tangled web. Before Jack could ask more, Sheriff Croft's voice boomed down the hall. "Time's up, Thorne." The deputy moved in, and Sam's face crumpled with fear. "Don't leave me in here, Jack. Please." "I'm not going anywhere." Jack said, his voice a low promise. He looked from his beaten brother to the arrogant sheriff visible at the end of the hall. The puzzle pieces were scattered, but the picture was starting to form. Sam's clue was all he had. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. As he walked out of the jailhouse and back into the oppressive sunlight, the cryptic words echoed in his mind. "It's not about the gold. It's about the land." The sun was a merciless hammer in the sky as Jack rode north, following the sluggish curve of the Redemption River. The water, thick with silt from the mines upstream, flowed brown and lifeless. Sam's words had burrowed into his mind, a desperate mantra against the rhythmic plodding of his horse's hooves. He pushed aside the image of his brother's bruised face, focusing instead on the task at hand. Doubt was a luxury he couldn't afford. After an hour, the terrain grew rougher, the river canyon narrowing as it climbed into the foothills. He saw it from a distance, a jagged silhouette against the brilliant blue sky, the broken pine. It stood alone on a high ridge, a skeletal monument to a long-ago storm, its splintered trunk bleached white by the sun. It looked like a gnarled finger pointing accusingly at the valley below. Jack dismounted, tethering his horse in a thicket of scrub oak that offered some concealment. He made his way up the steep incline on foot, his ranger training kicking in instinctively. He moved silently, using the rocks and sparse vegetation for cover, his eyes scanning the surrounding landscape. He felt exposed, a solitary target in this vast, empty wilderness. He reached the pine, its dead branches groaning in the wind. The ground around its base was a mess of loose rock and dry, cracked earth. He began to search, his fingers probing the soil, kicking aside stones. For a long while, he found nothing. Frustration began to prick at him. Had Sam been delirious? Had he sent his brother on a fool's errand? Then his boot struck something that wasn't rock. It was a hard, flat edge buried beneath a thin layer of dirt. He knelt, digging with his bare hands, the dry soil scraping his already bruised knuckles. He unearthed a small, oilskin-wrapped bundle. His heart hammered against his ribs as he untied the leather thong and carefully unrolled the contents. It was a surveyor's map, old and creased, but the markings were clear and precise. It depicted the entire valley, but with one crucial difference from any official map he had ever seen. A thick, dark vein was sketched across the land, running directly beneath the small, independent ranches that dotted the valley floor, including, he noted with a jolt, the parcel belonging to the family of Alara, the young woman from the general store. A neatly lettered annotation in the corner read, "Argentum lode. Preliminary assay confirms exceptional purity. Silver, a massive unrecorded silver lode." It all clicked into place. Kane wasn't just a land grabber. He was sitting on a secret worth more than 100 payroll wagons. He was systematically driving the ranchers off their property using intimidation-manufactured debt and framed crimes to acquire their land for pennies on the dollar before the truth came out. Sam hadn't been framed for what he stole, but for what he discovered. A twig snapped behind him. Jack didn't hesitate. He stuffed the map inside his shirt and dove for the cover of a rocky outcropping as a rifle shot cracked the silence. The bullet whined past his head, smacking into the trunk of the broken pine with a vicious thud. He drew his Colt, his mind racing. He was pinned down, exposed. 3 of Kane's men emerged from the trees below, fanning out as they advanced up the ridge. They were better armed and more determined than the saloon deputies. These were hunters. "Nowhere to run, Thorne," one of them yelled, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. Jack knew a direct firefight was suicide. He was outnumbered, and they had the better position. He had to use the environment. He fired 2 quick shots, not to hit them, but to force them to take cover. As they dropped behind rocks, he scrambled backward, sliding down a steep scree slope, using the cloud of dust and rock as a moving shield. He landed hard at the bottom, and the impact jarring his ribs. He didn't stop. He sprinted toward the river, the water his only chance. Bullets kicked up dirt around his feet. He could hear them crashing through the brush behind him, closing the distance. The riverbank was a steep 10-foot drop to the fast-moving water. Without a second thought, he leapt. The shock of the cold water stole his breath, the current grabbing him, pulling him under. He fought his way to the surface, gasping for air, and let the river carry him downstream. He heard the men shouting from the bank above, their figures receding as the current swept him around a bend. A sharp, searing pain exploded in his left shoulder. He'd been hit. The world began to blur at the edges, and the roar of the river mixing with the buzzing in his ears. He fought to stay conscious, his one good arm paddling weakly to keep his head above water. He had the knowledge, the truth that could free his brother and save the valley. But as he felt the precious map slipping from his grasp, torn away by the relentless current, a cold wave of despair washed over him. He had lost the proof. Wounded and empty-handed, he was no closer to saving Sam, and now he was being hunted. The stakes had just been raised from a simple frame-up to a fight for his life. The world returned in fragments of pain and cold. Jack found himself lying on a muddy riverbank, his body shivering uncontrollably. The sun was setting, casting long, distorted shadows across the canyon. His shoulder was a knot of fire, and his shirt was stiff with drying blood. He had no idea how long he'd been unconscious, or how far the river had carried him. He only knew he was alive. With a groan, he pushed himself to a sitting position. The map was gone. The thought was a lead weight in his gut. Kane's men would be searching, combing the riverbanks for his body. He had to move. He staggered to his feet, using a jagged rock for support, and began the slow, agonizing journey back toward redemption, staying hidden in the deepening twilight. It was well after midnight when he stumbled into the alley behind the General Mercantile. Every step sent a fresh wave of agony through his shoulder. He was losing blood, and his strength was failing. He leaned against the rough wooden wall of the store, his vision swimming. He had one last desperate gamble. He picked up a small stone and tossed it against the window of the living quarters above the shop. He waited, his breath coming in ragged gasps. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then a faint light appeared in the window. A few seconds later, the back door creaked open. Elara stood there holding a lantern, her face pale and etched with alarm. She wore a simple nightgown, her long dark hair unbraided and falling over her shoulders. Her eyes widened in shock as she took in his condition, the blood and the exhaustion, the raw pain on his face. "My God," she whispered. "Kane's men," Jack managed to say before his legs gave out. She didn't scream or hesitate. She moved with a quiet, powerful urgency, catching him before he hit the ground and helping him stumble into the back room of the store. The room was small and tidy, filled with the comforting scents of dried herbs, canvas, and soap. She helped him into a chair and bolted the door. "They shot you," she said, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and anger. "They know," Jack rasped, clutching his shoulder. "About the silver." Understanding dawned in her eyes. The silver lode wasn't a secret to her. It was the reason her family had been fighting Kane for years. So the rumors were true, she murmured, more to herself than to him. "My father always said there was more under our land than just rock and dust." She lit another lamp, her movements efficient and steady. She brought a basin of hot water, clean cloths, and a bottle of whiskey. "This is going to hurt," she said, her voice softening with a hint of sympathy. As she cut away the sleeve of his bloody shirt, she spoke in hushed tones. "Kane has been trying to force us out for 2 years. First, he dammed the creek upstream, cutting off our water. When that didn't work, my father had an accident at the mine. He fell, they said. But he was a careful man. He never fell." Her voice trembled for a moment before hardening again. "Now he just sends his men to threaten us, to burn our hay, to make life impossible. He wants our deed. He wants it all." Jack gritted his teeth as she probed the wound with a pair of tweezers she'd sterilized in the lamp's flame. He could feel her gentle but firm touch, her surprising strength. He saw the resolve in her eyes and knew he had found an ally. "I found a map," he said through clenched teeth. It showed the whole load. I lost it in the river. The proof, she whispered, her face grim. She finally extracted the bullet, dropping it into the basin with a soft plink. As she bandaged his shoulder with clean linen, their hands brushed. A current of warmth passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of their shared fight. For the next few days, Jack healed in the small back room, a prisoner of his own weakness. Alara tended to his wounds, bringing him food and water. Her presence a quiet comfort in the tense, waiting silence. They spoke in low voices, piecing together Kane's plan. They realized he wasn't just a tyrant. He was a meticulous strategist, using legal loopholes and brute force in equal measure. He was isolating the holdouts, turning the town against them, making them seem like stubborn fools standing in the way of progress. One evening, while Alara was minding the store, Jack felt strong enough to move. He needed more than just her word. He needed his own proof. Under the cover of darkness, he slipped out of the mercantile and made his way to Kane's office at the mining company headquarters. The building was dark and silent. He picked the lock on a side window, his fingers surprisingly nimble despite his injury, and slid inside. Kane's office was a monument to his ego. A massive oak desk dominated the room, and the walls lined with geological surveys and maps. Jack searched quickly, his eyes scanning for anything that might incriminate Kane. A ledger, a letter, another copy of the map. He found a locked drawer in the desk. Using a letter opener, he jimmied it open. Inside, among land deeds and assay reports, was a small velvet-lined box. He opened it. Lying on the faded fabric was a tarnished silver locket, engraved with the delicate image of a wild rose. Jack's blood ran cold. He had seen it before. It was identical to the locket that had belonged to his wife, Sarah. A family heirloom she had worn every day until her death. His mind reeled. It had to be a coincidence. A common design, perhaps. There was no other logical explanation. It was impossible. He pushed the thought away, dismissing it as a fevered trick of his exhausted mind. He couldn't afford to be distracted by ghosts. He found no other proof, no map, nothing to tie Kane directly to the frame-up. He slipped back out into the night, the image of the locket burned into his memory. He returned to the storeroom just as a patrol of Kane's men passed by the alley, their lanterns cutting sharp, menacing beams through the darkness. He held his breath, hidden in the shadows, realizing how close he had come to being discovered. Back in the safety of the room, he said nothing to Alara about the locket. It was a phantom from a different war, one he had fought and lost long ago. But as he lay in the darkness, the seed of a terrible, unsettling thought had been planted. It was a coincidence too sharp, too personal to be ignored. And for the first time, Jack Thorne began to wonder if his past and his present were about to collide in the most devastating way imaginable. The plan was desperate, a long shot born from the quiet tension of the mercantile's back room. Jack knew he couldn't fight Kane's army head-on. He needed a higher authority, someone outside Kane's sphere of influence. Through Alara's contacts, he learned that a federal marshal, a man named Riggs, was due in the neighboring town of Stone Creek to handle a territorial dispute. If Jack could get to him, if he could present his case, he might have a chance. He sent a message via a trusted freighter arranging a clandestine meeting in Stone Creek's livery stable at dusk. The risk was enormous. Leaving the relative safety of redemption meant exposing himself, but staying meant watching Sam hang. As the sun began to bleed behind the western peaks, Jack rode into Stone Creek. The town was larger than Redemption, busier, but the feeling of being watched was just as potent. He dismounted at the livery, the scent of hay and horse sweat thick in the air. Marshal Riggs was already there, a tall, imposing figure with a stern face and a sweeping gray mustache. He looked the part of an incorruptible lawman. "You're Thorn Riggs?" asked his voice, a low baritone. "I am," Jack said. "Thank you for meeting me, Marshal. The law in Redemption is corrupt. Silas Kane runs the town, and he's framed my brother for a crime to get his land." Jack laid out the story: the silver load, the missing map, the ambush at the Broken Pine. He spoke with the clipped, factual precision of a ranger giving his report. Riggs listened intently, his expression unreadable, nodding occasionally. "It's a serious accusation," Mr. Thorn, Riggs said when Jack had finished. "You say you have no proof? No map?" "No, sir. But my brother is an innocent man. If you come to Redemption, if you launch a proper investigation—" "Oh, an investigation will be launched," Riggs said, and a slow, cold smile spread across his face. "Starting with your arrest for the murder of 3 of Mr. Kane's deputies." Before Jack could react, 2 men stepped out from the shadows of the horse stalls, their shotguns leveled at his chest. It was a trap. The marshal was on Kane's payroll. The realization hit Jack like a physical blow. He had walked right into it. His last hope had been a lie. "You're a long way from Texas Ranger," Riggs sneered. "Your reputation doesn't mean much out here." Suddenly, the livery doors burst open with a tremendous crash. Jeb the blacksmith from Redemption stood there, a massive forging hammer held aloft. In the street behind him, he had overturned his heavy wagon, creating a chaotic blockade that sent horses rearing and people scattering. "Run, Thorn," Jeb bellowed. The diversion was all Jack needed. He kicked a lantern into a pile of dry hay which erupted in flames. Smoke and chaos filled the stable. He lunged at one of the shotgun-wielding men, disarming him in a swift, brutal movement, and sprinted for the back exit as Jeb held off Riggs and the other man at the front. He didn't run far. Fueled by a white-hot fury, he made his way back to Redemption under the cover of darkness. He wasn't running anymore. He was finished with secrets and shadows. He strode directly to the opulent house that sat on a hill overlooking the town, Silas Kane's fortress. He kicked the front door open. Kane was in his study, sitting behind his massive desk, a glass of brandy in his hand. He wasn't surprised to see Jack. He looked up with a calm, predatory smile. "I was wondering when you'd stop playing in the dirt and come see me directly." Thorn Kane said, his voice smooth as silk. "Did you enjoy your chat with Marshal Riggs?" "Who are you?" Jack demanded, his hand hovering over the butt of his Colt. "This isn't about silver. It's about me. I saw the locket in your desk. My wife's locket." Kane's smile widened, a chilling, triumphant expression. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small, faded photograph, sliding it across the polished surface of the desk. It showed 2 young men brothers standing side by side. One was a younger, harder version of Silas Kane. The other was a face Jack had tried to burn from his memory for 5 long years. A young outlaw named Ethan Roberts, a boy barely out of his teens. "You remember him, don't you?" Kane's voice was soft, but laced with venom. "The last member of the Miller gang. The one you cornered in that barn outside Laredo. The one who begged for his life before you put a bullet in his heart. The botched raid. The incident that had driven Jack to resign from the Rangers. The memory flooded back, the smoke, the shouting, the kids' terrified eyes. Jack had been ordered to bring them in, dead or alive. Ethan had made a sudden move, and Jack had reacted. A mistake. A fatal one. "He was my brother," Kane said, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "My younger brother. His only crime was falling in with the wrong crowd. He wasn't a killer. Not like you." He stood up, his composure finally breaking. My name isn't Kane. It's Roberts. Silas Roberts. After you killed Ethan, I lost everything. Our family was ruined. So I came west, rebuilt myself, and waited. I learned everything about you. I learned about your brother Sam. I learned about your precious Sarah and her family locket. He pointed a shaking finger at Jack. You took my family, so I'm going to take everything from you. This whole town, this elaborate scheme. It was never about silver. It was always about you. I framed your brother to bring you here. I'm stripping you of your honor, turning you into a fugitive. And when you have nothing left, no brother, no name, no hope, then I'm going to take your life. I want you to feel what it's like to have your entire world burned to ash, just like you did to me. The revelation struck Jack with the force of a physical blow. The fight wasn't for land or justice anymore. It was a ghost story, a blood feud resurrected from a 5-year-old grave. He was trapped in a meticulously crafted drama of another man's, making a deeply personal battle not for land, but for a redemption he never knew he needed. The world had shrunk to the size of Silas Roberts' ambition for revenge. With Marshal Riggs painting him as a murderer and Sheriff Croft ready to enforce the lie, Jack was no longer just an investigator. He was a fugitive. He slipped out of redemption under the cloak of a moonless night, the weight of Robert's confession pressing down on him. He was a ghost in his own life, hunted by the very law he once embodied. He found refuge in the high country in an abandoned line shack, known only to a few old prospectors. Jeb the blacksmith brought him supplies, his face a grim mask of loyalty. The town's on edge, Jeb reported, handing Jack a parcel of dried meat and bread. Roberts is squeezing everyone. He's telling them you're a killer, that you're the reason the law is cracking down. Roberts, sensing his victory was near, accelerated his plan. He posted notices all over town, his authority now backed by a federal warrant. All remaining independent land deeds in the valley were to be turned over to the Redemption Mining Company for a final non-negotiable price by noon the following day. Any who refused would have their property seized, their claims declared forfeit. It was checkmate. He was forcing the ranchers into a final, hopeless confrontation. As if mirroring the turmoil below, the sky itself began to turn against them. A dark, ominous line appeared on the western horizon. The air grew heavy and still, the light taking on a sickly yellow hue. A sandstorm was brewing, one of the massive gales that could scour the landscape and blot out the sun for days. The storm became a pressure cooker, a physical manifestation of the closing trap. From his vantage point in the mountains, Jack watched the town prepare for the dual onslaught of Roberts and nature. He saw the ranchers gathering at Alara's store, their faces etched with despair. They were broken, ready to surrender. He knew then that his second great obstacle was not escaping Roberts' men, but overcoming the town's shattered spirit. He descended from the mountains as dusk fell, the wind picking up whipping dust into his eyes. He didn't enter the town with guns blazing. He walked into the tense gathering at the General Mercantile, a wanted man walking willingly into the lion's den. The ranchers fell silent as he entered, their hands instinctively moving toward the pistols at their belts. Fear and suspicion warred on their faces. Alara stepped forward, placing herself between Jack and the others, a silent declaration of her allegiance. Jack didn't make a grand speech. His voice was quiet, raspy from the dust, but it cut through the tense silence. He didn't promise them victory or an easy fight. He offered only the hard, unvarnished truth. Silas Roberts doesn't want your land because it's valuable. He began, his gaze moving from one weathered face to another. He wants it because it's yours. He's a man consumed by revenge. And this whole town is just a weapon he's using to destroy me and my brother. He told them everything about the raid in Texas, about Roberts' true identity, about the personal vendetta that had masqueraded as a business dispute. He held up no map, offered no tangible proof beyond the conviction in his voice. "He's counting on your fear," Jack continued. "He thinks you're broken. He thinks you'll hand over your homes, your futures, because you believe you have no choice." He looked at Alara, then back at the ranchers. "He's wrong. You have a choice. You can sign his papers tomorrow and live the rest of your lives on your knees, or you can make a stand. Not for me. For yourselves. For the simple right to own the ground beneath your feet." An old rancher, his face like a wrinkled leather map of his hard life, spat on the floor. "Stand with what, Thorne, a ghost and a federal warrant? We're farmers, not gunslingers." "I'm not asking you to be gunslingers," Jack said. "I'm asking you to be stubborn, to be courageous. Roberts is one man propped up by hired guns or bought lawmen. His power comes from your belief that he is unbeatable. All we have to do is show him he's not." It was Alara who turned the tide. Her voice, clear and steady, rose above the murmurs of doubt. "My father died defying that man. I will not be the one to spit on his grave by surrendering what he bled for. I stand with Jack Thorne." Her courage was the spark. One by one, the ranchers straightened up. The despair in their eyes was replaced by a slow-burning anger, a rekindled pride. They weren't an army, but they were no longer a herd of sheep waiting for the slaughter. They were men and women pushed too far with nothing left to lose. As the first gusts of the sandstorm rattled the windows of the mercantile, they began to forge a plan, and their hushed, determined voices, a small rebellion against the howling wind and the tyranny that threatened to consume them all. The sandstorm hit at dawn, plunging the world into a howling, dusty twilight. The sun was a pale, impotent disk behind a thick veil of grit. Wind shrieked through the streets of Redemption, tearing at signs and shutters. It was the perfect cover. The final confrontation was set for the place where Kane's power originated, the abandoned silver mine at the edge of town, where he stored his records, including the forged deeds he intended to legitimize. Jack's plan was simple and desperate: use the mine's labyrinthine tunnels to ambush Roberts and his men, retrieve the deeds, and expose him once and for all. Jack led the small band of ranchers, their faces wrapped in bandanas, against the stinging sand. They slipped through the storm-swept town, unnoticed ghosts in the gale. Alara was with them, her face set with grim determination. Jeb the blacksmith carried his forging hammer like a battle axe. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they moved with the quiet resolve of people fighting for their very existence. They entered the mine through a secondary ventilation shaft, plunging into a claustrophobic world of darkness and dripping water. The air was cold and smelled of damp earth and stale dynamite. The howl of the sandstorm was a muffled, constant roar, like the breathing of a great beast. Jack's strategy relied on chaos and confusion. They split into two groups. Jeb and a few ranchers would create a diversion at the main entrance, while Jack and the others, including Alara, would navigate the tunnels to reach the mine's central office. The fight, when it came, was brutal and disorienting. Gunshots echoed and re-echoed in the narrow tunnels, the muzzle flashes providing the only light. It was close-quarters combat fought with pistols, knives, and fists. The ranchers, fighting on familiar ground they had once worked, used the darkness to their advantage. While the battle raged in the tunnels, Alara noticed something terribly wrong. The town's water supply, fed by a reservoir deep within the mine, was being diverted. Following a small trickling pipe, she found Doc Finch, the cynical town doctor, standing over the main wellhead, emptying the contents of a glass vial into the water. A bitter almond-like smell hung in the air. Poison. Dr. Alara's voice was a shocked whisper. Finch spun around his face, a mask of panic and grim resolve. He promised me a share, he stammered, his cynical demeanor stripped away, to reveal a weak, greedy man, a way out of this miserable town. He was going to blame it on you ranchers, a final desperate act of sabotage. He lunged at her, trying to push her into the well. But Alara, hardened by years of fending for herself, fought back with a fury he hadn't expected. She grabbed a heavy iron wrench from the wall and swung. Their struggle was desperate and silent, a life-or-death battle in the heart of the mountain, overshadowed by the larger war raging around them. Meanwhile, Jack had reached the central cavern that served as Roberts' office. Silas Roberts was there, waiting for him, flanked by his last 2 loyal gunmen. The forged deeds were in a metal box on his desk. "It ends here," Thorne Roberts snarled, his face contorted by hate. The final duel was not a clean, honorable gunfight. It was a raw physical brawl amidst the swirling dust and collapsing timbers of the mine. Jack took out the 2 gunmen with the cold efficiency of his ranger days, but Roberts was driven by a fanatic's rage. He charged Jack, and they crashed over the desk, scattering papers and maps. They traded blows, their grunts and curses lost in the roar of the storm outside and the groaning of the mine's supports. Jack gained the upper hand, his fist connecting with Robert's jaw, sending him sprawling. Jack stood over him, his Colt steady in his hand, aimed at the heart of the man who had orchestrated his ruin. In that moment, he saw the path of vengeance laid bare before him. He could pull the trigger, end the cycle of hatred, and embrace the same darkness that had consumed Silas Roberts. He saw the face of the young outlaw Ethan in his mind, and the years of guilt that followed. But then he saw Alara's face, Jeb's, his brother Sam's. He saw a future. With a ragged breath, he lowered the pistol. He kicked Robert's gun away and hauled him to his feet. "It's over," Jack said, his voice raw. He had a choice: become the killer Roberts believed him to be, or prove him wrong. He disabled Roberts with a swift, disabling blow to the shoulder, the same place he himself had been shot. He chose justice, not vengeance. Just as he secured Roberts, a section of the mine tunnel groaned under the pressure of the storm and collapsed, sealing the main entrance, but leaving the ventilation shaft open. The battle was won. As the sandstorm began to lose its fury, its howling shrieks diminishing to a low moan, a new sound reached the exhausted survivors in the mine, the steady, determined ring of horses' hooves. A posse of men led by a lawman, whose star glinted even in the dusty gloom, rode into what was left of Redemption's main street. This was not the corrupt Marshal Riggs. This was Marshal Evans, dispatched from the territorial capital after Jeb, in a heroic storm-racked ride, had finally reached a telegraph office 2 towns over. Evans found a scene of devastation and revelation. He found the ranchers bruised and bloodied, but standing tall, holding the retrieved box of forged deeds. He found Alara, who had subdued the treacherous Doc Finch, and now stood guard over the poisoned well, the evidence of his crime irrefutable. And in the heart of the mine, he found Jack Thorne standing over a defeated Silas Roberts. Faced with the mountain of evidence, the deeds, the poison, the testimony of the townspeople, and his own confession, which came spilling out in a torrent of bitter rage, Roberts was arrested. Marshal Evans clapped him in irons, along with the sniveling doctor and the few of Roberts's men who had survived the fight. The first person Jack sought out was his brother. The cell door was thrown open, and Sam stumbled out into the gray post-storm light, blinking like a man emerging from a long, dark dream. He was still bruised, but the frantic fear in his eyes was gone. He and Jack didn't embrace or exchange grand words. They met in the middle of the dusty street, and Jack simply placed a hand on his brother's shoulder. "It's over, Sam," Jack said quietly. Sam nodded, his throat too tight to speak. In that shared silent moment, the years of strain between them, of Jack's weariness and Sam's recklessness, began to dissolve. The old wounds, raw and deep, were finally starting to heal. The townspeople emerged slowly from their homes, their faces smudged with dust. They looked at the wreckage, at the arrested men being led away, and then at Jack. Their gazes were no longer filled with suspicion or fear, but with a quiet, dawning respect. He was not the haunted drifter who had ridden into town days earlier. He was the man who had given them back their homes, their courage, their future. As the sky cleared and a weak sun broke through the clouds, the people of redemption began the slow, arduous task of rebuilding. They swept dust from their porches, righted overturned wagons, and spoke to one another with a renewed sense of community. They had faced the storm both inside and out, and had survived. And at the center of it all stood Jack Thorne, a man who had come seeking justice for his brother, and had in the process found a town worth saving. Weeks passed. The raw wounds of redemption began to scar over, replaced by the quiet industry of rebuilding. The valley seemed to breathe easier, the air clearer, now that the shadow of Silas Roberts had been lifted. The federal marshal had seen to it that the land deeds were returned to their rightful owners, and the promise of a real lasting peace felt blessedly within reach. The town council, a newly formed body of ranchers and merchants led by Jeb, met in the now-repaired saloon. Their first order of business was to offer Jack Thorne the permanent position of sheriff. The town needed a lawman. They could trust a man who had proven he would stand for them, not above them. To their surprise, Jack refused. The weight of his past still clung to him like the alkali dust. He saw the ghost of Ethan Roberts in his dreams, saw the years of running, and felt unworthy of the star they offered. "I'm not a hero," he told them quietly. "I'm just a man who ran out of places to run." The next morning, Elara found him at the livery stable saddling his horse. His saddlebag, the one with the torn leather, was repaired, and his few belongings were packed. He was preparing to leave to ride on to the next town, the next horizon, as he always had. She stood at the stable door, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "So that's it?" She asked, her voice soft but firm. "You save us all, and then you just disappear." "It's what I do," Jack said, not looking at her as he tightened a cinch. "I clean up the mess and I move on." "You're wrong," she said, stepping closer. The scent of soap and prairie sage seemed to follow her. "What you did, that wasn't cleaning up a mess. That was planting a garden where there was only rock. You gave these people hope. You gave me hope." He finally turned to face her. The weariness in his eyes was still there, but it was softer now, less haunted. "Elara, the man they think I am, he's not real. I've made mistakes. Costly ones. Everyone has," she countered. "That's not what defines you. What defines you is what you do next. Do you keep running from the ghosts? Or do you turn around and build a home so strong they can't get in?" Her words struck a chord deep within him. He looked past her at the town of redemption. He saw children playing in the street. He saw Jeb hammering a new sign for the blacksmith shop. He saw life returning with a stubborn, resilient beauty. For the first time, he didn't see a place to leave behind. He saw a place to protect. He finally understood that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about having the courage to build a new future despite it. He walked with her out to the edge of town, to a quiet spot on a low bluff that overlooked the entire valley. The sun was warm on his face. Without a word, he reached into his saddlebag and took out the small framed photograph of his wife. The glass was still gone, the tears still visible. He looked at it for a long, silent moment, his face a mixture of sorrow and love. Then he knelt and began to build a small cairn of stones. He placed the photograph gently within the rocks and covered it. He was not forgetting her. He was letting go of the guilt, laying to rest the part of him that had died with her. He stood up his shoulders, feeling lighter than they had in years. He turned to Alara, and for the first time, a genuine smile touched his lips. He rode back into redemption alone. He strode directly to the jailhouse where the town council was gathered. He walked to the desk where the sheriff's star lay polished and waiting. He picked it up, its weight solid and real in his palm, and pinned it to his chest. He stepped out onto the main street, a new man in a town reborn. The wind still blew down from the high peaks, but it no longer sounded like a lonesome spirit. It sounded like a promise. Jack Thorne, no longer a haunted drifter, stood ready to protect his new home.